Whether it's state-licensed therapy or biblical counseling, people will often wait until they're at their most vulnerable or even desperate before seeking help through counseling. Maybe they're grieving a loss or dealing with a tumultuous home environment and don't know how they'll be able to keep moving forward. It's already a fragile and frightening place to be in, and even more so when you consider how humbling and nerve-wracking it can be to reach out for help. Practitioners who claim to offer that help then have a duty to do everything they can to treat their power responsibly, to not take advantage of clients' vulnerability, and prioritize the well-being of the people in their care over any other interests. But instead of being met with empathy and understanding, far too many people who turn to biblical counseling are confronted with the cold rigidity of dogma. And when that dogma is rooted in patriarchy, the results can be catastrophic, especially for women. On top of the already fraught power dynamics of any therapeutic or counseling relationship, biblical counselors are wielding spiritual authority as well. The assumption of their position is that they will be trustworthy, caring, and wise, when that's not the case. When counselors abuse their position by either outright harming clients themselves or knowingly allowing them to be harmed elsewhere, I think the world needs to hear about it. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist chair. My guest today is Julianne Smith, a survivor of spiritual abuse and a prominent advocate for those harmed by authoritarian and abusive practices within Christian communities. Not incidentally, Julianne also made national headlines when her former pastor attempted to sue her for $500,000 after she left a negative Google review about the church that she'd escaped. Long before that, though, she grew up bouncing between Catholic and Baptist. But after she met her husband at a charismatic, non-denominational church, that's more or less the way they stayed. He was in the military, so they moved around a lot. And wherever they went, they sought out churches that were more on the charismatic side. But it was during their time when they were stationed in Virginia, Julianne's husband started getting involved with a different kind of church culture.
It was there when he was invited to go to a men's leadership group. Actually, it was open to all of the men. And in that men's leadership group, I believe is where he was connected with a pastor and who was teaching Calvinism. And he changed after that. That's probably when I first noticed the change, a spiritual change. And he was trying to get everybody on board with this, and he would do one-on-one discipleship with people. That was the beginning of a change, a spiritual change in him. When we moved back to Oregon, he found himself, I don't know if he looked for it or what, but he was connected with other groups that taught Calvinism. Again, it was with the men only, which was kind of weird. We were at a pretty decent Baptist church for several years, and he didn't like it. And that's probably because it wasn't Calvinist. There were a couple other issues that he had with it, but that's when he found another church to go to, which turned out to be the cult that we were in for 2 years. I say it's a cult. You know, it had all the signs of it, like shunning and legalism, all kinds of crazy rules for how women should dress, what colors they could wear, that kind of thing. I didn't like it from the moment I stepped foot in there. I sensed an uneasy feeling. And slowly but surely, I noticed that all of my time was taken up with doing activities for the church. And I was getting isolated from friends and family and very judgmental about anybody who was not connected with that church. His way was the right way and the only way. And so that was the cult for 2 years. And I did not want to be there. And I told my husband, I don't like it. I feel horrible after being there. And he insisted that I needed to be there because it was the true biblical teaching. And basically, he was trying to say that I needed that hard gospel message. So for some reason, I wasn't good enough and I needed that. And so that's why he wasn't wanting to leave.
After 2 years, they did eventually leave. But 2 years is a long time to be trapped somewhere that you don't want to be. And there's some backstory here that might give a sense of why Julianne sometimes had a hard time trusting her instincts and convincing others that what she experienced was real.
My husband was stationed in the Philippines. My daughter and I were going to go get our nails done. And we were going to the Officers Club beauty salon. And I heard construction workers with the jackhammers. And keep in mind, the Philippines is in the Ring of Fire. So there's earthquakes there all the time, really minor ones that you could feel often. And it feels like the ground is always soft. So if a truck is going down the road, you can feel the vibration. So I felt some vibration and I thought it was the jackhammers across the street. Then the jackhammer stopped and it was still shaking a little bit. And then I looked up and I saw the poles moving back and forth, just swaying. I realized, this is an earthquake. I saw somebody in a bikini coming out from the Officers Club swimming pool, just run out random, just looking around. And then I heard women screaming from the Officers Club beauty salon. I realized, okay, this is legit an earthquake, a big one. And so I was concerned about the wires on the pole. And so I told my daughter, let's get back in the car. We got in the back seat of my car and there was a Jeep Cherokee next to me. When I looked at it, it was doing little hops on the ground. It was the weirdest thing. Everything swaying back and forth. We were fine. We will never know how many people died because it's so remote and they don't have the tracking methods that we have in the States. But yeah, it was a 7.9 earthquake, which is pretty intense. I know that there were 653 aftershocks that very first week after the earthquake. So it felt like the ground was moving more than it was still, if that makes sense. And after a while, you just got angry because enough already. I just want to be back to normal. I'm tired of paying attention to the ground and if I should take cover. I really was going crazy about that. And I noticed most people were on edge. We'd go to the commissary and just people were really short-tempered and it affected everybody in so many different ways.
Julianne says she was losing it. She had 2 young kids. She wasn't sleeping at night and felt like she couldn't even trust the very ground beneath her feet. So while her husband was sent to the Persian Gulf, she and the kids flew home to Oregon to stay with Julie's parents.
My reality was different than everybody else, which was weird. So, when I would say, do you feel that? And everybody would say no. And so that was crazy making. Why am I feeling this? I'm not even in the Philippines. And if it's not happening, obviously, you could only come to a certain conclusion that it must be in my head. It was really scary. So when I went to, let's say I went to a mall, I was looking for the exits. I knew where they all were. I became hyper vigilant on my surroundings and knowing where the safe places were, because if anybody was going to survive an earthquake, it was going to be me. I knew how to do that. But normal people don't go to a mall or a store and say, okay, where's the exits? And it didn't get any better. So, yeah.
Julianne knew she couldn't keep living that way, especially not while raising children. She needed to find her footing again and be able to trust her perceptions and feel confident that what she was sensing was real. So she reached out for help. And as she had throughout much of her life, she turned to the church.
I went to an old church that I had gone to, and they directed me to this woman there. And I went and saw her, and she told me, we need to see if you have any sin in your life, because that might be why you're not getting over this. Because I'm praying, I'm listening to praise music, I'm reading the Bible. I was desperate. Just give me anybody at this point. Evidently, people had been helped by her. So when I went, I thought it was weird to be asking my sins, unconfessed sin. It's like, I think I would have said them if I knew about it. I would have taken care of that already, but trying to go back and imagine, I was desperate. So I did whatever she asked me to do. I wasn't functioning well as a human being, from not eating well, not getting enough sleep. It was just hanging on by a thread. So I was ready to grab a hold of anything that could help me. The primary thing that I remember is that the reason why I'm not getting healed is because I still have unconfessed sin.
The woman who counseled Julianne practiced as a biblical counselor. And while Julianne doesn't believe it was officially nouthetic counseling, a form of Christian counseling we touched on in the last episode, it bore all the familiar hallmarks. As a recap for those who missed it, nouthetic counseling is a method that rejects psychological or medical explanations for human struggles and instead attributes all problems to sin. The solution, according to this approach, isn't therapy or treatment. It's repentance, obedience, and becoming a better Christian. That was the message Julianne kept hearing, whether it was called nouthetic or not.
It definitely put me more in harm's way because I did everything she told me to do and my symptoms got worse. I was reading and praying, and so it just made me feel like, okay, well, if I've done all of this stuff spiritually to get right with God, and yet I'm still feeling this, maybe he truly has abandoned me. And so he must not love me. But what's sad is you just think about somebody else going through that. I know what it did to me, and someone could harm themselves. See, that's so common in Christian churches. They want to handle it themselves rather than turn it over to an expert who understands mental health and trauma.
Julianne tried to go along with it and do all of the right things, but she could tell it wasn't helping. If anything, it was making it worse. And the culture shock after moving home from the Philippines certainly wasn't helping. Eventually, a woman at church recommended a mental health therapist for Julianne to meet with. And the way that practitioner treated her was worlds apart from what she'd experienced in biblical counseling. He validated her experience and actually listened to her. She only met with him for a few months, but after moving to Maine, Julianne decided to continue to work with a different therapist. She was able to realize that those long-term effects from the earthquake weren't just about the earthquake.
She brought insight and validation and clarity to me to help me understand why I had responded the way I had, and made me feel like I wasn't crazy, that my responses were legitimate, were appropriate, and some of the ways that I responded were because of my trauma, and it was absolutely normal. And twice a week, did the hard work, dealt with my childhood trauma. And I just remember one day I was in a church parking lot and thinking, wow, I haven't felt an earthquake in a while. And I couldn't remember the last time I had. All of a sudden it dawned on me, I'm better. Maybe this is my new normal again. And it was just shocking. I thought I was going to be living with earthquakes and that hypervigilant way of looking at exits and being the only one who will get out alive in an earthquake. I thought that would last forever. We want to handle it in-house. Anything that is negative, they don't want it to go outside of their walls. So it could be a divorce. No, you can't get divorced because they think it's a reflection on them. You want to have happy, healthy families, happy marriages. Nobody has any mental health issues, because if that's the case, then obviously I'm doing something wrong. I think there's a power trip there for pastors or church leaders.
Speaking of power trips, let's fast forward back to the church in Oregon, the one that felt like a cult to Julianne. After she had started getting some distance from that church, she noticed that she wasn't the only one who'd been affected by that church in some pretty dark ways. Her son was depressed. Her daughter said she could never go back. And Julianne started noticing a pattern of others the same age as her kids, who'd managed to get out of that church but were now suffering from a range of physical and mental health problems. It was strange, but too many people were affected by it for it to seem just like a coincidence. So Julianne decided she needed to warn others. Something was seriously wrong at that church, to the extent that people who escaped seemed to have long-term issues. And that's exactly what she wrote about in her Google review.
After he saw the Google review, the negative Google review, he didn't like that, and he thought that was defamation. And so he sued us all for $500,000. And I got a wonderful attorney who is an expert in free speech and First Amendment. And she took our case and we won it, which was great. But what I noticed is after I got sued, my story went public and it went very viral. MSNBC, I think CNN, it was everywhere. It went international as well. And I got about 500 emails. What I noticed was not only, oh, I hope you win. That's awful. What kind of a pastor would sue somebody? That obviously shows that he was a cult leader. But also people connected with my story and they started telling their own stories. And they weren't going maybe 2 paragraphs. They were giving me pages. I was just struck that these people spent so much time writing their stories. It felt to me that they probably hadn't told many people or maybe nobody. And I realized that we need an outlet for people to tell their stories and to understand that there are other people who have gone through spiritual abuse, who've been harmed in the church, and they're not alone. And so that was why I did the blog. I've known for a long time that when people tell their stories, people can connect with those. So I started outing people, exposing people, as long as I had sufficient evidence and things to back up these claims. I did not want to get in another lawsuit. So you can be sure that I was investigating very, very carefully, and I had stuff to back up what I said. And so in some high-profile cases, I had exposed years before people finally got the message and realized what was going on. There's Talian Chavijan. He's Billy Graham's grandson. He had clergy sexual misconduct with at least 6 women that I discovered. Doug Phillips was very, very popular in the Christian homeschool movement, and he had a relationship with his nanny. And then as soon as she became an adult, it turned sexual. And then another case was Ravi Zacharias with Lori Ann Thompson. I shared that story on my blog. And I think it was 4 years after we shared that story that people finally believed it. People were mad at Lori Ann. People were mad at me. And my track record is pretty stellar. You might want to take a closer look because we have the receipts. So yeah, I've exposed a lot of people. So I spent a lot of time doing that to try to raise awareness about church abuse, whether it's through spiritual abuse or sexual abuse or covering up sex abuse within the church. It is spiritual abuse if a pastor decides he's not going to go tell authorities that he knows of sexual abuse going on. And that happens all the time. My life experience has touched so many different areas. My antennas are up on Christian nationalism and Reconstructionism and these leaders who hate women and are trying to get back to the old way, biblical law, and it's not good.
Julianne's blog was one of the resources that tuned me into what was happening at Doug Wilson's church in Moscow, Idaho. She shared stories of abuse survivors who had been doubly harmed by Christ Church's refusal to defend them and pursue any kind of justice or accountability for their abusers. And to be clear, this isn't limited to Christ Church or even to Moscow. While it's not every church, this kind of harm happens in churches everywhere across many denominations. One of those survivors is a woman named Jen, who describes being emotionally, verbally, and financially abused by her husband. The 2 of them started going to the church's biblical counseling center, both together and separately, where Jen was eventually told the ongoing problems in her marriage weren't about her husband being abusive. They were about her not being committed enough to her faith. In 2018, Jen received a letter from a man named Mike Lawyer, which I've been given permission to read here. Mike was the executive director of the Biblical Counseling Center. He was also an instructor at the college Christ Church operates, and he worked alongside Doug Wilson to help start the church way back in the 70s. so he had the authority to send this letter on behalf of the church as a whole. He writes, "Dear Jen, as you know, I've spent hundreds of hours with you, praying for you, giving you advice, and sharing Jesus with you. When we first started to meet, your husband was angry, unloving, and didn't try to understand you or your situation very well. Since then, he has made significant changes in every area of family life. You, on the other hand, have been going in a very different direction. You have denied the biblical Christ, are doing the bare minimum in caring for your home and children, as seen in your husband's needing to do the vast majority of cleaning and food preparation, allowing your children to be raised by strangers in daycare, etc. And you are completely ignoring the God-given roles and relationship of a wife for her husband. There is no respect, submission, or even the fundamentally cordial relationship that roommates should have. Through all of this, you have refused to meet with us to help you resolve these issues. Instead, you have gone to others who, instead of helping you repair the difficulties of your marriage, are encouraging you in a direction that will destroy your marriage. Based on your unwillingness to deal with these sins, we are suspending you from the table of the Lord until you realize that your choices have caused you to sin in these serious ways, and confess your sin and repent. We previously told you that if or when you find another evangelical church to join, we would transfer your membership to them. That is still the case. However, that transfer will be accompanied by an earnest letter of reprimand. You mentioned in a letter to me you didn't like threats. This is not a threat, but it is a warning. 1 Thessalonians 5:14. We really are concerned for your eternal state. Jesus said in the book of John, "Just because a branch is on the vine does not mean it is safe from being cut off. A branch that does not produce godly fruit will be cut off." Jen, you really are in danger of being cut off. We implore you to think about eternal things. Return to Christ, love God, submit to and respect your husband, love your children. In summary, we are disciplining you for the sin of refusing to take responsibility for your share in creating a toxic home. Signed, in him, Mike Lawyer, on behalf of Christ Church, Church Session. Jen came to him for help because she was being abused. According to the church, her husband had made changes, but clearly not enough for Jen to feel safe staying in that relationship. She turned to the church for support, and instead she was told the toxicity in her home was her fault. When abuse victims reach out for help and are met with blame, it doesn't just fail them, it protects the abuser. This is how cycles of harm are reinforced in the name of healing or forgiveness. She's told that she denied Christ and abandoned her calling as a woman of God to serve her family. But Jen, at the time this letter was written, was working a full-time job to help provide for her 5 children. And as far as denying Christ, she told Julianne that she still believed the fundamental tenets of her faith, but she dared to ask some questions about interpretation or how her faith applies to her life. But that wasn't good enough. In these kinds of systems, you have to believe the things we tell you to believe, play the part we prescribe you to play, or you'll be cut off, banned from the communal table, and maybe even at risk of eternal punishment. It's gaslighting in the name of Jesus. Because through the lens of Christian patriarchy, it's more important for men to be honored, served, and appeased than it is for women to feel safe in their own home. You can read more stories about Christ Church and other places over on Julie's blog, spiritualsoundingboard.com. And you can follow her on Blue Sky at Defend the Sheep. I'd like to thank her so much for sharing her story with us and helping shine a light into some truly dark places. A special thanks to the writer of this show, Bo Denton, and to Peachtree Sound, our excellent audio engineers who always bring it together. And to you, the listeners, thank you for your continued support. If you found this episode meaningful, please consider following the show and leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Be sure to join me next week as we continue this series on biblical and faith-based counseling.